recording. And we are live. And just waiting for our audience. We do have Councilor Don remote.
Okay, welcome to the planning board meeting for April 19th. We have two items on our agenda tonight. The first is a joint public hearing with the Planning and Development Committee and Committee of the Whole on Ordinance 141 regarding short-term rental units. And then we have a pre-application conference for a project of 49 to 57 Merrimack Street. And there's some basically planning board business with that. So I will begin by calling the roll for the planning board. Alden Clark.
Here.
Steph Delano.
Here.
Rob Cook.
Here.
Jamie Pennington.
Here.
Heather Rogers.
Here.
Don Walters is absent. Richard Yeager is absent, and Britt Taylor. So we have six of us, I believe, yes. And I will ask for Councilor Cameron to open the planning development public hearing.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ed Cameron, so I'm the chair of the City Council Planning and Development Committee. And this matter for the joint hearing on the short-term rentals has also been posted as a committee of the whole. So besides the three committee members, other councilors are able to participate as well in this. And so I'd like to call our portion of the meeting to order. So I'm the chair of Planning and Development. We're also joined by committee members, Councilor Preston and Councilor Wright, and other members of the City Council, Councilor Vogel, Councilor Z, Councilor McCauley, and President Shand. And also, sorry, Councilor Donahue remotely.
Thank you. So the way tonight's hearing is going to work, we're going to begin with a presentation by the sponsor, Councilor Z. Then we will have questions from members of the planning board and members of the city council. But that would be focused on questions, trying to clear up anything that is not really understood. At that point, we will open up to the public hearing and ask for members of the public to make their feelings known about this proposed ordinance. And after the public hearing is done, after everybody has spoken who wishes to speak, we will close that portion of the public hearing, but that doesn't mean we're keeping the public hearing, we're closing the hearing itself. It could be that after tonight, we will continue the hearing, at which point there will be opportunities for further comment. And then following the public comment part of the meeting, depending on the time, we may have time for some discussion and debate among the members of the council and the planning board, the planning and development committee. So with that, I would ask Councilor Z to begin the presentation. Sure.
That works. Does that work? Okay. Good evening, Chair Tainter and Chair Cameron and members of the public, as well as members of the planning board and city council. I'm very grateful for the opportunity here to have a couple of minutes to try and introduce this proposal. I tried my best to anticipate questions in an effort to make sure that the proposal itself is understood. And I know this has been a long road, so everybody's fairly familiar with it. And I'm going to work with the board here who will kindly view the slides for me. So this is what I put together. It looks long, but it's about 10 to 12 minutes, so it's not terribly bad, and I'll try and move through as quickly as I could. But I want to start off with a brief history. Many in this room don't need it, but just to give us some context, I want to talk about what I was thinking about in terms of goals and problems trying to be solved with this, and then actually explain in just plain language what the proposal is. Probably get a little bit of my intent out of it, and then I'll just close it out. So those are the 4 parts, and we'll just jump right in. So as a brief history, I had to rack my brain, but the conversation about short-term rental seems to go back to 2016 is when I first remember it being discussed. So it's been quite some time. We've had multiple starts and stops on it here locally. As many know, the state in the interim did pass their occupancy tax and registration requirements. And that has been in place now for a couple of years. Probably the most in-depth piece of legislation we've considered on the topic was so-called Ordinance 46 back actually proposed in 2020. I went back and pulled the date, and it did not, unfortunately, meet success last year. So we fast forward. As a result of the outcome of that vote, letters were issued to all operators in the city, at least those that the city could identify. I know some of those have reached out to me, perhaps to others as well, sort of trying to outline what that meant, but difficult at best to do so. This ordinance is coming to you in February of 2023. It's been went into the packet in the council of February. And I did put in several months of efforts to have conversations with all kinds of stakeholders, some of whom are in this room, people who were very pro short-term rentals, folks who maybe were not so pro short-term rentals. I also did work with KP Law to review draft after draft, not for endorsement, just to be clear, but just for form and substance. And that, wasn't triggering any third rails or any major concerns from that respect. The process continues. And just in the interest of full transparency, I'm the proposer of this amendment, so this presentation is to be taken with that context in mind. So what are the goals? It's really not actually all that atypical for any zoning. It's to create a legal zoning framework and structure for short-term rentals that balance competing interests. And why is essentially the same reason we have all zoning, which is to create some form of predictability for all property owners, which may be those who want to do short-term rentals and those who may ultimately end up abutting them or living near them, and as well as to create a framework for enforceability. The reason I put this slide in has been interesting to hear from different stakeholders that following the vote last year, some felt that the failure of the amendment was positive for them because they didn't like short-term rentals. And so based on some recent case law out of Linfield, that meant the short-term rentals were not allowed in the city. And that was a positive outcome in that sense if you were not one who was very pro short-term rentals. Ironically, those who want to do short-term rentals also saw it in some ways as a victory because it continued the gray area that we've been struggling to get out of. So it's been interesting to hear both sides think of it that way. But where we are right now seems very unsustainable. I myself am a ward counselor, so I get a lot of the neighborhood questions. I know all of us do at large and ward, and it's been very difficult because we don't have anything on the books for this. And while we can go back and rely on the thin amount of case law, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's working. So I do feel that we're compelled to do something. But with that being said, there's one thing we're not trying to do, at least directly with this proposal, and that's to solve day-to-day issues. So many will remember that there's a companion ordinance to this. It's a licensing ordinance. That is still alive. It's still in license and permits. That's the one that answers questions about, okay, I'm having a problem at 11 p.m. on a Friday night. Who do I call? Who can enforce, who can come out and shut something down or stop it, things along those lines. And that's not atypical as well. In this one, we're trying to create that broad framework about where in the city this should be allowed, not allowed, and under what conditions. So I wanted to make that clear that the licensing is very much alive and still a very important conversation. But my perspective was, if we can't get to some level of compromise and agreement on this question, we could spend all day on the licensing and we probably will not end up with a positive outcome. So thank you, Andy. Next slide. So finding that balance, these are some summaries of essentially the arguments on both sides of the table. On the one hand, we are concerned about neighborhood character and feel. We're worried about day-to-day impacts and nuisances, noise, trash, parking. There are these macro concerns about housing stock, long-term rentals, availability for purchase that are real concerns. Parking is a famous conversation in every sort of thing, and then concern about guest turnover, people coming and going from homes and the way that they may in a short-term rental. On the other hand, you do have these other positive sides of things that have been expressed. Property rights, of course, are always the core of zoning conversations and how people choose to use their properties. There have been lots of discussions, public comment and otherwise, about the added economic vitality and improvements that come as a result of short-term rentals. There's a lot of conversation about it's similar to other uses that already exist in the neighborhood, like long-term rentals, things like that, and that there have been many short-term rentals in the city that have actually operated for quite some time without anybody in many cases even knowing. So this slide is not meant to take a side. This slide is to show you what both sides of the conversation are. Next slide, please. So when I sat down to start writing this, the concept I kept coming back to is, this is one of those sort of mythical creature short-term rentals where it's sort of in between business and residential. And depending on the flip of the coin, you can put your finger down and say it's a business, or you can put your finger down and say it's more of a residential use. So I tried to use this philosophy in drafting. How do you come up with something that sort of doesn't just think of short-term rentals as one thing, but tries to separate these out, and then in accordance with that sort of zone around those concepts. Self-regulating, put that in quotes. I just wanted to say that I've written several zoning amendments in my time. And one thing I'm a big fan of is when you get it right, it actually kind of self-regulates, and it doesn't require somebody to be calling constantly, because you don't want that burden to be on the neighbors. You also, if you are a property owner, let's say you're doing short-term rental, you need to have some expectation too. So it's pretty vital that we get it right here. And when I say I'm not here to convince anybody, obviously I'm here to hopefully convince you that this proposal makes sense. But I think we need to sort of transcend this conversation in the previous slide. There are pros and cons to this. We can go around about public comment many times and we will hear the same things, and there actually is validity to all of them. And I recognize that, and I wanted people to hear themselves in this presentation so that they could know that they were being heard. And that was the point of putting them up there. Thank you, Andy. So let's get into what's proposed. Before I walk you through the proposal in plain language, obviously the R3 district is a central core tenet to this proposal. So it made sense for me to explain to you what R3 is first, before I explain to you the actual proposal. So I pulled this from my map, this map here on the right, essentially to first just define where is R3, because we wouldn't want to expect everybody to know where it is off the top of their head. So R3 is that kind of rust-colored, orange-colored section, and I've basically given you the bounds. So it's Fair Street to the bridge, and then generally up to High Street, and a little bit on the other side of State Street, sort of think of the CVS type area and so forth. That's what R3 is. R3 is a very interesting district. It's called the multifamily district, but it's also got multi-use. It allows for things like bed and breakfasts and lodging houses and things along those lines that's already codified, that's not new. So R3 presents an interesting, I think, opportunity for us to find some measure of compromise on this short-term rental thing. So hopefully, and I'm guessing most in the room have read this ordinance maybe several times, noticed it's much shorter, much simpler, tried to get rid of some of the confusion of the different classifications. And basically, I'm down to 3, and I'm proposing 3 classifications. The first one's called owner-occupied, and it is the person's primary residence in either HSR A or B, R1, R2, R3, B1, B2, or B3. So I'm focused here on the map on, R3, because that I know is where a lot of questions are going to be, but generally you can think of it feathering out from there to R2, and then feathering out from there beyond there out to R1. It sort of went in an easterly and westerly direction. These are owner occupied. So this is the person's primary residence. This is where they live. And so they've got to demonstrate that occupancy, that residency as a condition of having this use allowed for them. They can run one of them, which makes common sense because you can only have one residence anyways. And there is an allowance to not be present every night of the year when it's being used as a short-term rental. And I kept the 120 days, which I thought was a hard-fought compromise from the last time. You may recall it vacillated between 90 and 180, let's say. 120 seemed to be sensible and really capturing, frankly, that snowbird situation where somebody leaves for 4 months or so in the winter. Fairly straightforward. So you live there. So you live there. And so R2, R3, these really R1, when you add up all of these together, they really do cover pretty much the whole city, with the exception of like industrial areas and so forth, where there are no residences or residential type uses anyways. So that's the owner occupied. That's the first category. The second one is investor. This is obviously a very controversial one. It wasn't the last time. There was no allowance really, in my opinion, for it in the last one, and it was a real point of contention. I have tried here to open a compromise path, open a door for us to go through. First thing is it's much narrower in scope. It's only B1, B2, and B3, which are your business districts. And then again, that R3 district, which essentially is centered around the downtown, but really is the core of the city where things get busier and you start to see commercial uses and things like that happening. One other major difference is whereas the owner occupied is permitted, investor units are special permit before the zoning board of appeals. So not you here on the planning board, but your colleagues on the zoning board would be the ones to issue those special permits. The special permit is purposefully a heightened process. It creates a process for notice to abutters. It creates an actual formal process for a hearing. It creates the opportunity for a legal appeal. These are all things that I'm not inventing. These are functions of what a special permit is under state law. And again, we're trying to limit operators to one of these. And that's conceptually similar across all of these for the most part to prevent over proliferation, just overtaking of short-term rentals. And then the third category is your Plum Island, and that's to allow short-term use with some of the basic tenants, but with fewer restrictions as has been consistent with the historic use on the island. And those are your three. So there's no more owner adjacent and home this and whatever home share. It's just three of them, and that's what they are. And it really boils down to, does the person live there or not? And then which districts is allowed in. One thing that's very vital to return back to that licensing concept is that all of these are contingent upon a license being in place and being maintained. So zoning, we think about uses and allowing use, and then you have that use, but this use is predicated on a license. So if your license gets yanked, you no longer can do a short-term rental, and that's where we're going to get into the licensing if and when we get to some sense of clarity on this is here. And the other thing I inserted into here was a zoning review, meaning that this was an area of discussion. It's a bit wonky in terms of how in-depth it is, but a zoning review being done by the zoning officer, and then that having to be renewed every 3 years. I propose that if you are running a short-term rental and then all of a sudden you pull a permit, building permit or something to that effect, you essentially have to redo your zoning check, so to say, so that we can try and catch anything rather than waiting 3 years maybe for something to happen. So that's the first part. Next slide, please. So to continue, there are more details, of course. It's not a super long ordinance, but there are many details in it. I love tables, which is why you see tables in there, but then they have a lot of info. So there are some sensible limits on bedrooms and guests. You see those 3 and 6 respectively for bedrooms and guests, 6 and 12 on the island. One area, another thing that came up last time was condos. This does not seek to supplant condos and their right to eliminate short-term rentals in their bylaws if they choose. That's their own decision to be made. In the B2 and B3 districts, they have to be on upper floors. So these are not to be on the first floor, where I think we expect more retail and activation of the streetscape and all that kind of stuff to hear about. I did put in here no nuisances, no in-laws. In-laws are not allowed to be short-term rentals, no campers, none of that stuff, and not in the 40R district. Those nuisance in-law, that's actually survived from the last draft. So this is essentially the same thing there. And then a lot of discussion at times went into how does this actually get implemented? You can't just do it overnight. So I put in a 180-day grace so that people can get it together, so to say, and be ready for implementation. All right, next one, I'll put on my flame suit, which is parking. I know this is always a controversial one. So aside from just the broad should short-term rentals be allowed, this is probably the second most controversial thing, and how much time was spent on parking. And again, I propose we split the baby here. I'm going to say it in this sort of goofy way, but I came up with first bedroom free. That's my proposal. It's like a commercial for a used car. You get the first bedroom free. You don't need any more parking for one bedroom. So if you're running a pretty low test short-term rental, it's literally you're sharing a room in your home. I've heard about those. Hey, I'm doing this to stay in my house. It also generates some income. You don't have to show an additional parking of any kind. But if you want to do the second or third bedroom, and remember, you can't have more than 3 bedrooms anyways. That's in the previous slide. Then you have to show one spot, and that spot has to be over and above your underlying uses. So if your underlying uses require 2, and then you're going to add this, now you need 3. And if your underlying 2 are already pre-existing non-conforming, you don't have them, that's okay. That was an intricacy that was hard to get around, but we're not going to reach back into a previous use. We're looking forward to the short-term use to avoid legal issues, but also just simplification. So that's what it means by above any underlying uses. So you can't come in and double count the same space for both and say, oh, that's for that and it's for this as well. Don't worry, it works out fine. You have to show a distinct. And then lastly, there are application requirements built in that will probably be buttressed by things in the licensing, but registration with the state, which has been spotty. I know some folks are very data oriented and have pulled the data, the registrations from the state. They're so-so, but we would require that. Ownership and residency for the owner-occupied units. And then I've already talked about the height requirements for investors in terms of the special permit, but their applications are also heightened as well. They have certified plot plans interior layouts, things that we don't expect residents just, literally renting out a room or two and maybe doing the snowbird thing to have to comply with. Next slide, please. So this is my pitch. It's the middle of the road. It's very hard. You talk to many folks and you can leave the conversation feeling one way or the other. It's not perfect. Clearly, as with any zoning, especially with this, it's very difficult. And you quickly realize as you draft, you have to give up on trying to satisfy every case. I personally work in software during the day, and if we tried to hit every case, we'd never actually turn out a product. And the same thing is true here. We're trying to really create this 30,000-foot framework that makes sense for the city. There are edge cases that will not be captured by this, that are just too odd or too difficult. And once you start opening small doors for an exception here or there, you realize the whole thing quickly sort of unravels. So that's really my hope, is that folks who oppose short-term rentals broadly will see sort of the value in the process being created here, the limits that have been imposed. Those who are pro short-term rentals will recognize there's an avenue to do it. If something like this were to pass, we actually have something on the books that allows for it, rather than, again, operating for everybody in the gray. So last slide here is just a couple of anticipated questions. So what about licensing? I talked about that a couple times. Yes, absolutely, have to have it. We will work on it. Hotel comes up all the time. It's funny, I've gotten emails saying you have to have short-term rentals to entice them to see that the hotel is needed. You know who they is. And then others say, don't have these because if you have them, then no hotel will ever come. I think for me anyways, we should just do what we think is best for the city, what we can all live with in terms of the neighborhoods. We can't necessarily build public policy solely on the sort of outcome of one specific out place and possibly even one specific landowner. Condos, I talked about that, that was a bone of contention last time, but just to be very clear again, condos can have their own bylaws, and this didn't seek to supplant those or override them. So they can ban them, and many have, from my understanding. Can this be handled by licensing alone? It cannot. You have to have it allowed in the zoning in order to have licensing. That's essentially the whole heart of the Linfield case. It wasn't allowable use explicitly, therefore it doesn't exist. So enforcement, huge question. Enforcement really isn't the work of the city council, the legislative body. It's the administrative body, but or the administrative executive branch, pardon me, I'm losing my words, but I have had lots of conversations with Andy and Jennifer, and I think, we have to build something that can be enforced first. Right now, it's been a little bit hard, I'll just say it that way. KP Law has looked at, 6 drafts of this, again, not to endorse it and say they love it, that's not their role, but to identify any major craters, of which there are none. And so that's good. And I hopefully will give some confidence here. Do we know how many short-term, do you know, how many short-terms we will lose? I have no idea. I stopped thinking about that question while I was writing, because in some senses, we don't really have them now in the first place. And second is, it's very hard to build, I think, a zoning ordinance looking at it that way. So I don't know. I also think the data is very suspect, and I frankly felt a lot of time got lost into that black hole of conversation last time around. So I'm looking to convince folks that the theory makes sense, the philosophy makes sense. WMD and WMU, what's up with those? I left them consistent with the last one. In conversation, my take is that it seems very likely that some of those properties are in the wrong zone. They just shouldn't be in WMU anymore because that's not really what we envision for them. But I don't want to open that can of worms. This is already a can of worms. So it's like having a can of worms inside a can of worms. And then last one is, are you open to amendments? Of course, if there's an idea that can make it better. But what I guess I'm not open to respectfully is just, if you ruin sort of the foundation of it, it's very hard to do it. And I think we ended up with a bit of a Frankenstein because of that over the past 5-7 years. So I would like to see if there's buy-in on that philosophical level. And then of course, if the language can be tweaked or something can be changed, but foundationally, I hope that it is sound and that everybody will agree to some degree. And that's it. I think that's it, right? Yeah. So thank you very much. I hope it was helpful, and I'm happy to answer questions that maybe I didn't anticipate or that I could help with.
Thank you for the presentation. That's very helpful. So at this point, as I said earlier, we're going to open it up for questions. clarifications, things you don't understand, questions I think about attempt for the sponsor before we go to the public hearing. And maybe it'd be good to start with the councilors.
We're happy to have plenty for ourselves.
Does anybody have any questions for the sponsor? Okay.
All right, well, I think it's Mike, I just wanted to know for the record, I think we have Councilor Khan remotely.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to clarify one point on, in item number 4, in there where it refers to, it mentions various things and what has to be specified. It mentioned bedroom for the operator and so forth, but it's really, when it's referring to investor units and so on, that's not required, but it's just, it's there just if it does come up. Is that correct?
So if you're talking about number 4, Romanet, and then Romanet number 4, those are required. If it's an investor applying for a special permit and they're going for a zoning review, those items A, B, C, et cetera, which includes the interior floor plans and the bedrooms,
Right.
are expected to be presented.
Okay.
If the language needs to be tweaked to make that clear.
But it's referring to the investor STRUs, and an operator is not required to be at the unit. But it talks about specifying the bedroom for the operator.
They're not required to be, but they may be. And if they,
Exactly.
so if
I
you
just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
that
Yeah, and
It's
if you
not
broke the
required.
120 days, then you could become an investor unit. And so I get it. We could clean it up just to make it clear. There doesn't have to be a space for the operator. Understood.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And so you did mention the WMD areas and so forth. I still have a concern that there are several single-family, two-family houses in the conservation zone specified, and so this excludes those from this. So in effect, there's no related change to the zoning map to account for that. So those homeowners are essentially being penalized for not being able to take advantage of this if they so choose. And okay, so then just another question. You mentioned talking about the number of units, and you didn't really get tied up in looking at the number of units that were maybe become illegal and so forth. But just was curious, did anyone look at the number of units that are on the state registry that are outside of the R3, B1, B2, B3 zones, which is where the investor units would be excluded?
Yeah, on the AgCon, it is a fair comment. I mean, there are some homes that are in AgCon, but I can't speak again for anybody else, but AgCon is pretty special in my opinion. The whole goal behind it was to maintain as little impact, I think. So it's a policy question and a debate. In terms of the number of units, I know that over the years of this discussion, I know Jennifer Blanchet has done some level of that analysis, and I also know a couple of residents are very deep into that, but I don't have the numbers to present. We could ask for them, but I personally felt like I got lost into that conversation, and I couldn't trust the data enough to really, because not everybody registers, and that's been proven, I think, several times now that we don't really know how accurate the registry is comparatively.
Right, granted, I just wondered if
Yeah,
you had an
but it's a
idea.
fair
Yeah,
question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No more questions at this point?
Councilor Z, first I want to thank you for the effort that you have put into this. It's not an easy task. I know you've worked very hard on this. So I think all of us appreciate very much the opportunity to take a look at a different spin on all of it. That being said, I think there are a couple of fundamentals that you've talked about a little bit, but I think they really need to underpin the entire amendment. And I always look at this through the lens of the the opening statements in the amendment, which are fundamentally no negative impacts on the neighborhoods. And, there are a couple of things in here that I'd really like to ask you about. One has to do with, fundamentally owner responsibility and owner presence when a unit is being rented. And I'm curious about the 120-day opportunity for owners to be absent, because I think in combining some of the different owner occupied types from the previous amendments, you've created an opportunity where, in my experience, what I see a lot is short-term rentals are weekend rentals. So that might be a 2 or 3 day a week rental. And if you allow an owner to not be present for 120 days, if you do the math, 52 weekends out of the year, 2 or 3 nights on a weekend, that's all of those 120 days. So the byproduct of that is an owner doesn't ever have to be present when they're renting their unit on a weekend. And I think what we're trying to avoid here is, particularly in R1 and R2 neighborhoods, which are the most sensitive neighborhoods, I think, that we're talking about here. But if this becomes a neighborhood of empty houses that are occupied by strangers on weekends, that's not protecting our neighborhood. So I think in your efforts to simplify, I think there's an opportunity created for an owner occupied unit to almost look like an investor unit, the owner just not being present. The other one, and we don't have to get into it too much, but the discussion about parking, I'm sure will be extensive. And I'm just concerned that in your efforts to simplify, we may be further relaxing standards, from previous versions of this amendment that really sought to protect them. But in particular, I wanted to ask you about the 120.
So to respond to the two biggest points, I think the reason I kept the 120 again was I thought it was a sensible compromise, and from the last effort, and I know that number has vacillated a little bit, and I think the biggest argument was the snowbird argument. You could be gone for essentially 4 months, November, December, January, February. To your point, yes, to me, the self-regulating is extremely important. And when I think about owner occupied, is even if they're not there on the weekends, that owner, that's their neighborhood. Those are their neighbors. They know them. They may go away on the weekends. And I think you're right, in an extreme case that could be gone every weekend of the year. Respectfully, I'm not sure how realistic that scenario is, but it could happen. It's possible. To me, it seems like one of those edge cases. But if they have to be there Monday through Friday, the point is they have to answer to their neighbors. They have to be there. People usually have their neighbors' cell phone numbers. They know them. And so it's a policy question, just like any others. If you're asking me if I can live with sort of that risk, I can, in the sense that it's still owner occupied. They've got to come in and demonstrate ownership of that property. They have to have some investment, in my opinion, in the neighborhood. And so if they want to travel the world on the weekends and they want to rent it out, they can. And then if it becomes a party issue, then that's where the licensing steps in, and you say, not happening anymore, license gets pulled, or there's so many complaints, they have to come in for a hearing. Those are some of the ways, I think, to mitigate some of those risks. On the parking, I just want to say real quick that, one of the arguments last time was that by having too strict parking, you're creating a de facto ban. That was the argument. So in other words, if we said, okay, it's two spaces per bedroom or something, we'll just use a number or whatever it is, that the argument was, well, you're not really allowing short-term rentals then. And so I was just trying to find a way to, again, find the middle of the road. I still think it's actually pretty tight, in my opinion. And in some neighborhoods, it will be very hard to show that extra space, on some properties. In fact, on many properties, probably in R2 in the South End, which I represent, will be very hard to show that. But we have to have some lines on both sides. And so I don't want to come across as, people leave and say, wow, he really likes short-term rentals or he hates them. I'm just in the middle of the road here. And so to me, those are my answers on those two. Very much a
Back
risk,
to the
but
120 days.
Yeah.
I think my concern, and I think my neighbors' concerns, and in the R1 and R2 district, the concern is immediate. You know, if there's a problem, who can you talk to right then? You know, if your neighbor who operates the short-term rental unit comes back on Monday and there were problems all weekend, it's kind of too late at that point. So, you know, I think there needs to be a presence, particularly in the R1 and R2 neighborhoods, so that neighbors are assured that there is oversight. You can't vet every renter that's coming in. There needs to be oversight. There needs to be responsibility on the owner's part. And if there's 120 days of I don't have to be there, that could be every weekend. And you know, maybe I'm not traveling the world, but maybe I'm not paying attention to what's going on in my house either. So I think you've got to really think again.
Regarding the registered number of units in the state, I believe that they're not all registered, and that some are and some aren't that are existing right now. Of the ones that are registered, do you know, is the city taking in tax dollars via the state that come through these platforms? Are we benefiting in any way right now from taxes on short-term rental units that are registered in the state?
yes,
Are we using those in our annual budgets?
yes, they become general fund revenue and then they get budgeted like any other dollar, correct?
So in theory, we may have a loss of revenue year over year if we shut down some that are registered in the state now, that we'll have to make up for in other ways.
Possibly. I mean, it could be that you have some that fall off because they're no longer allowed. It could be that you have some that come on because now you force the non-registered one side. No projection has been done. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. But yes, there's a line for occupancy tax, which also encompasses, you know, the few bed and breakfasts and things like that we have. And the state has been, I only know this because I happen to chair budget, but they've been very recalcitrant to give us fine granular data about how many short-term rentals there are and so forth, because privacy concern is what we've been told. So we don't actually know exactly the number, but yes, we are getting money from this. We get a cut, essentially. That's automatic as part of the state law that passed. If this were to pass, if some short-term rentals fell off, yes, in theory, it could result in a reduction.
Just a quick follow-up on that. If there is tax revenue, is there a way to dedicate that revenue to a third party? There's discussion previously about hiring a third party consultant to manage the short-term rental environment in the city. Would there be an opportunity to dedicate that tax revenue to that process and not let it drift away to other uses?
I'm going to say generally, yes, and not try and get to leads on it, but we do have revenue sources that get tied to certain things. We do have challenges sometimes where we cannot bind the hands of, you know, future administrations or councils for all of time to give money to a certain thing. You've seen that at the state level too, but I would just say generally, yes. And just note too that building revenue, such as building permits, which is, you know, a substantial amount of money, that's also considered general fund revenue at this time. And some of it does get peeled off to the, you know, in a sense, to the building departments and to some degree the planning office, but it's indirect. It goes into the big bucket of the general fund and then it gets appropriated through the normal process.
Any questions from councilors or planning board members?
I just was curious about the rationale for restricting the short-term rental units in the smart growth district. And then I also just wanted to make a suggestion that in the table, the section 3, requirements and restrictions, just where it mentions 120 days, that it specify 120 days per year.
Per year, you said, sorry.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. The smart growth district non-allowance, if you will, or disallowance in that is a holdover from the previous one. I think that we did have a lot of conversations. I mentioned briefly the macro concerns over affordable. 40R, I think, really was designed to create high volume housing and 25% affordable. And I think that was the rationale for disallowing it in 40R. And I think that was important to some people. And I think it makes it's defensible. So I left it in. And I think that's why it remains.
I have a couple of questions. I may have asked you these already in previous discussions. Let me just, again, just trying to focus on understanding the ordinance. So the first thing is in the definition. It talks about a short-term rental as being using short-term rentals for more than 14 cumulative days of the year. So does that mean that somebody who rents for a couple of weeks or even for 7 weekends is not a short-term rental, and are we defining that as something that would be allowed just as part of normal residential dwelling unit use?
Yeah, so that is the definition. My understanding is that definition actually originates more, it's the genesis of it is state law and how they defined it. You're right, under this ordinance, if you rented for 3 weekends, which equates to say 6 or 9 days, depending on how you look at it, it's not considered a short-term rental under this ordinance. It also, my understanding, and I don't have the state law in front of me, but it also would not require registration with the state if you're not hitting that. That's like the low volume in a sense, it just doesn't count. So correct, we are not defining it here. Whether it then is allowed or not allowed is another can of worms, I would say, because it's not an explicit use, and that's where we are with this sort of thing. But I think the general philosophical goal was not to catch those cases where somebody's doing very few things.
So I believe this is actually the genesis of the 14 days is a special provision that was made for the Augusta area for the masters. And it's a federal law that was implemented specifically for the masters to allow those people to rent their homes for the masters golf tournament.
Interesting.
There's no golf course proposed in this ordinance.
I'm just wondering, something to think about. And I know we're not getting into the details, but it might be helpful to say explicitly that something that is up to 14 days of short-term rental is allowed. It's not considered short-term rental and is allowed as a right or something like that. Just so we don't have that gray area. The second question, and I'm sure it's in here somewhere. There is a statement in footnote L that says, by definition, all STR use terminates after 3 years. That's true. I can see that for a special permit. Is that somewhere in the ordinance for the zoning administrator's approval as well? I didn't see it. Maybe I'll just raise that question.
Yeah, yes, I mean, the intent certainly, this was an invention, I think, of KP. Primarily was this invention of this sort of modified by right kind of concept where it was time delimited and we spent a lot of time, and then we got into conversations that seemed a little bit tenuous with how to do this. But the general intent is that the zoning determination is good for 3 years in all cases, except that it comes immediately due if you go and you pull a permit and you want to modify your property. That was the intent behind this, to try and again wait for the 3 years to elapse. Say somebody came before your board to ask for an A&R, or who knows, any sort of thing, or a subdivision or things like that, that would trigger an immediate, whether it was 1 day later or 2 years, 9 months, and 3 days, that move it up.
I guess there's something to look at to make sure that's explicitly stated. And under this, each bedroom theoretically could be rented separately, the same way it is for a B&B. There's nothing in here that says that you could, if you had 3 bedrooms for rent, you couldn't rent them all to 3 different parties.
There is nothing to that effect, no.
So that could affect parking in that, I guess, but just something to
Yeah, I just to say, I think
Can
that
you use
came
the
up.
microphone just
Yeah,
so we can hear?
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, that came up a lot in both directions where people said, well, if you bring in a family of 5 and there are 3 kids and they only have 1 car. And conversely, to your point, you could have 3 different people renting and they have 3 cars. I just think at some point you take a middle, you take a shot at it and you say it's per bedroom and you let these cases kind of feather themselves out. But I do recall those conversations and again, strong, positive, reasonable arguments on both ends.
And I guess my final question for now is, in some of our uses, we have specific standards for special permits. For a specific type of special permit, we have standards that are in addition to the general standards in the zoning ordinance. And I don't think there are here. I think you're basically defaulting to the general special permit standards. And I guess the question, have you considered whether whether there should be some special standards for this because of the difficulty perhaps of determining whether something has impacted the
Yeah, so to confirm, correct, there are no, this defaults essentially back to the state statute, the substantially not more detrimental standard that we're all pretty familiar with. Did I consider writing standards? Yes, you see some of the hard standards in here in terms of the application requirements. You have to present these things. There's more things if you're an investor unit versus owner occupied. It can be a little bit more informal. But to be honest with you, I don't know that it could be written better than that standard. It is a difficult standard. I acknowledge that. I know the zoning board, this is, and to a degree, your board faces the same challenges as. But to me, the real benefit is the process. You build around the process of the notifications to the abutters that are, all the things that have been built into state law, you automatically get to take advantage of, the appeal rights, et cetera, which were the subject of much conversation last time. So it's very hard to write, and to say, okay, this is the standard. So I think my take on it is going for a special permit is a big ask, in my opinion, and it requires a lot. And you saw the R3 map there. I think that the challenge with Newburyport is that the middle of town is a city almost in a sense, and then there's no feather down in terms of it doesn't go 3 streets and then it's residential. It kind of hard cuts. So I think where I see the R3 coming into play is the board being able to sort of discern in individual cases based on a butter input and feedback, just as they do with anything, with any type of application, and do what they see fit on a case-by-case basis in a way that we couldn't write it in a way. Because if we could write it, we could just make it ministerial and say, check the boxes, we have the permit. So, very difficult.
Thank you. Before I open this to public hearing, does anybody else have any questions?
I'm sorry, if I may.
Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? I hear an echo.
We can hear you.
Okay. Was any kind of cap considered or limitation of how many we allow in the city? I'm just sort of curious.
Yes, I did think about that. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Yes, that was considered. I did think about it, but I kept coming back to the challenge of how do you decide who gets them? And you can do a lottery, and that can have an inherent fairness or unfairness to it. You can do first come, first serve, but that's challenging as well. And I kept remembering the transient vendor licenses we had, and then you end up with weird things where somebody's trying to hold on to it and pass it down from generation to generation. So instead, I opted for more of a limit on the number an individual can operate or an organization can operate in an effort to get to the same endpoint, which is to not allow it to get too out of control or too many people without having to tangle with that tough question of saying there's 100 licenses, come down. It's like going to Ticketmaster and trying to get tickets on the morning of and or putting the board in a tough position to say, okay, you get a permit, you don't get it. Again, back to the standards question. So did not opt.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I will open up to public comment. And just, as I said earlier, this may or may not be the only time that to have your public comment. If we continue this hearing, we will certainly reopen the public comment period. But I'd like you to come forward and state your name and your address. And also keep in mind that your comment is a comment to us, to the council and the planning board and the sponsor. And we're not actually involved in debates or questions at this point. It's really making your comment, and we'll take that into account. So please come forward and speak. Yes, just go ahead.
Well,
Up to the podium.
Good evening. My name is Kevin Bannigan. I live at 43 Middle Street, downtown Newburyport. 35-year resident in the community. And I appreciate, Councilor Zeeb, your time and effort and thought into this process. However, on your first several, 3 or 4 slides, you never once mentioned verification of the property nor enforcement of the issues on those slides. And unless there's a process for verification of the strews tied to the addresses, an enforcement program for whatever policies you all come up with, it's going to fall apart. As I told you, I live at 43 Middle Street. I've been there for 35 years. I had to buy 2 more condos in my building to get the driveway. A current parking place in downtown Newburyport of the south end, and I have a listing sheet right here with Bentley Associates. Current parking space is valued at $65,000. That's for an easement, not even owning the land. On my street, on my block, strictly from Middle Street Foods to Fair Street, a row of brick townhouses, we have over 50 resident vehicles. Now granted, some of them have driveways. As I said, I do, 2-car driveway, but many of them don't. We also have 9 strews within 100 yards of my front door. And I'd be happy to provide the addresses to any of you that are curious as to what they are. I've been to the planning board zoning office a couple of times, and your enforcement criteria has never worked, and it will not work. So my question is, how are you going to know who has a registered property? How are you going to verify that property? How are you going to clarify the enforcement issues for that property and put a handle on this issue? I moved to Newburyport for the quality of the city and the town. I'm originally from New York State. I used to tell my friends, college and high school buddies, they'd say, well, tell me about Newburyport. I said, well, 25% artists and hippies, it's 25% yuppies, it's 25% blue-blooded Yankees, and it's 25% farmers that come in from the adjoining communities. Well, that's considerably changed, as we all know. And if you do own real estate, you've made a wise investment and are in very good shape financially. However, on my street, there are 3 investor strews in one building. These are $600,000 condominiums that are being exclusively rented for the purpose of strews. So I'm not against the concept, but I'm against the investor units wholeheartedly because they're not managed. They're simply in it for the dollars. They're getting $300 and $400 a night downtown, or $2,000 a week to pay the mortgage or to get payback on these properties. Speaking about the parking, 50 cars on one block from Middle Street Foods to Fair Street. These are residents. Granted, maybe there's 15 people that have a parking space off the street. However, there's very little control by the parking enforcement in the city of the issues. And in my opinion, granted, Middle Street is probably the most dense street and dense street in the downtown area. How are we going to know who the true tenants are? And in my case, I've seen one person rent the party. Let's face the property. They're here to enjoy themselves. And yet they've got friends, family, relatives coming. One car turns into 3 cars. Easily, that's not an exaggeration. I've also seen people carrying in sleeping bags, coolers, 2 adults and 3 children on my block. I don't mind the concept of the strews. The issue is the parking and the abuse. That's the issue. I propose a couple of ideas for you people to think about, that if anybody that has a strew and rents it, there needs to be some type of registration, forcible registration, and they get a nice big orange or.
Can I interrupt you, please?
Sure.
I was not paying attention to the 2-minute limit for some screen here. I should have done. Could you kind of wrap this up, and you can provide your comments separately as well?
My constructive criticism, if this is going to work, I've had conversations with people on my street. We've talked about forming a Middle Street Homeowners Association. We've talked about even hiring a lawyer, unless there are teeth in this issue, to prevent the problems and to remediate the parking issues. That's how bad it is. And we're taxpayers, we're here in the city, and my concern is the deterioration of the neighborhood. So that's all I have to say. If the city wants to really take this seriously, they should hire a part-time employee, 25 hours a week, to do the homework on the strews and to force some type of policy and or inspection and or fines. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. We'll do better this time. So, yes, please come forward. I will start the timer. Your time is ready. All right, pull that mic down for yourself.
My name is Kathleen Dunham, and I live at 21 Otis Place in Newburyport. We've owned our house for 53 years, and you have to come over Garden Street to get to Otis Place, which is a very small, very congested, little deplorable condition street right now. A lot of potholes. And there is a duplex house at 6 Garden Street. It is listed as a VRBO. It has 4 bedrooms, sleeps 8, with a small driveway. It rents for $5.75 a night. And this past weekend, it was rented to some people from New Hampshire. It is rented almost every weekend from New York, New Jersey, Maine. And parking is just terrible on that street. I mean, there's apartments on both sides, and they don't have room for their own cars. And so this is the listing says that it's hosted by a Bob. I don't believe the owner lives there. He can't, because he rents it out. It number 8 Garden Street is privately owned, and it's a 2-unit. It's not a VRBO. And the road conditions are very, very bad right in front of that house right now, but I believe that Ward 2 is going to have the roads fixed this time around. It's on that the owner does not live here, and this has been going on for years. Almost every weekend, it's rented out. People carrying things in. I mean, it has 4 bedrooms, so it sleeps 8.
Thank you. Thank you.
And, that's a lot. I don't know. And they do split it up. They must, because they come in more than 1 car, But it's very hard to get over Garden Street. And even for the people that live there to even find a place to park. I mean, I have a parking place.
Thank you,
but I don't-
Kathleen.
but
Thank you very much.
That's it. Okay, thank you.
Report, yeah. Go ahead. My name's Bob Courier. I live at 3 Summit Place in Newburyport, and I'm on the Affordable Housing Trust in Newburyport. The letter that I gave to the planning board tonight, I prior gave it to the city council. And my take is that city of Newburyport provide a tax revenue on short-term rentals. So my letter says, charging a 6% tax on short-term rentals in Newburyport would generate income that can be used to develop and build affordable housing in the city. The popularity of short-term rentals negatively impacts the inventory of affordable housing opportunities because the hosts are enjoying income from renting their homes at hotel prices. Tourism is popular in Newburyport, and with the absence of a hotel, short-term rentals are an obvious lodging option. The proposal 6% tax would be added and would not interfere with the landlord's profit. Many cities charge service or hotel taxes, so it's not a new concept. Revenue that the city of Newburyport would collect could be directed towards funding such needed affordable housing in our community. The city of Newburyport needs to provide equitable housing opportunities for folks who want to live here. Current rental prices are prohibitive to many of our people who would like to call Newburyport home. In addition, many long-term citizens of our city have been priced out of their housing. I am not suggesting that we discourage the use of short-term rentals. I am insisting that Newburyport has a civic obligation to develop funding streams and to begin to tackle its affordable housing crisis. And adding this 6% tax to the short-term rentals is a real good way to do that. We create a pool of revenue. The Affordable Housing Trust will then develop more affordable housing. Thank you. Do you have any questions? No? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Report.
Hello again, Michael Underwood, 21 Beck Street. Councilor Sharif, I want to first thank you. I agree it's not perfect, but I appreciate the effort. And I would encourage us to move forward and adopt this as it stands. I do think there's a couple of key issues. And honestly, I don't know if it's addressed by licensing or addressed by zoning ordinances, but we still have issues with enforcement. And I don't get how an ordinance now, or zoning ordinance now, will change enforcement when we can't already do it. I've stood in front of all of you multiple times talking about challenges that we have in our neighborhood. The fact that we've actually got a STRU that has been told not to operate and is continuing to operate. And I don't see how that changes with this new ordinance. And so I would encourage you, look, again, we got to start somewhere and potentially, I think, Councilor McCauley, you said this one time, let's start someplace and we can amend it as we learn. So let's start, but please, please figure out enforcement. For those of us that are living with bad actors all the time, you know, when we come to you and we give you a petition that's signed by every single abutter and nothing changes, I don't know what to do. Anyway, so thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Yes, come forward.
We didn't get there.
Yes, we did. Michael Underwood, 21 Beck Street.
Yeah, 21 Beck Street. Thank you.
Good evening, Judy Timon, 39 Lime Street, and I also wanted to thank Councilor Z for making the effort and listening to his constituents and bringing this forward. I will be brief. I agree with the comments that planning board member Robert Kaup made with regard to the 120 days. I also agree with my neighbor, Mr. Underwood, with regard to enforcement. There was an enforcement order issued and nothing happened. So in case you're under the illusion that because the order is issued by the zoning enforcement officer, the city does not have the political will to take any action with regard to that letter. That is beyond the scope of the enforcement officer. That person writes the letter and that is it. It is up to the city to take action. And the city has chosen not to take action. And it's just another comment with regard to parking. If you look at many of the reviews that you get for SRTUs in Newburyport, everyone loves Newburyport. You can walk everywhere. Well, one of the options is if you're running a business, part of the requirement for running that business is that you rent some spaces in the parking garage and your tenants use the parking garage for their cars because they all love to walk in this walkable community. So you walk, drop off your stuff, walk around. You don't need your car because it's such a lovely walkable community. It would relieve us of parking problems, traffic problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Jack Santos, 10 Spring Street. I'm a newcomer. I've only been here 15 years. I'm learning a couple of things tonight, actually. I love the idea of improving the utilization of the parking garage by getting those tenants, short-term rental tenants to use the parking garage. That's a good idea. I'm a little concerned. I didn't know about all the issues with enforcement. And if we have that many issues with enforcement, let's give our public servants a break and really have a tight ordinance here that we can loosen up later so we don't have to deal with enforcement issues. I do have to congratulate Councilor Zede. It's not often you see somebody put their hand in the fire a second time, and I think you've done a pretty good job. I'm surprised at R3 being included for investor owned. I just did a quick check of the state's stats. I realized not everybody registers for short-term rental. We have 170 here in Newburyport. 50 of them, a third, are in Plum Island. And that's, the island knows they're not going to lose their by right for a short-term rental. So you kind of guess that most of them are probably registered at Plum Island, and there's a lot that aren't registered in Newburyport because of that. So a third are Plum Island short-term rentals. And 4 of them are on Middle Street. So you can understand why there's so much problems on Middle Street with that kind of density. I would really encourage, there doesn't seem to be any of the hotel, inn, and lodging in R3. So if that was the initiative to be equitable with hotels and inns and lodging houses, I don't see any in R3. So why are we including R3? Keep businesses and businesses, investor-owned properties and business area. Business-owned areas. And finally, I absolutely agree with the planning board vice chair. Oh my God, 120? You're making it an investor-owned property. We've got to have people living in this. That's what contributes to Newburyport, is having that person-to-person interaction. I use short-term rentals all over the world, Paris, Sydney, where else? Germany. And it's talking to the people that you've rented from. That's what we need to encourage here in Newburyport. Let's keep short-term rentals at 30 days max for the inventors, where the owner's not there.
Thank you. Board, yes.
Hi, my name is Ken Swanton. I'm at 10 Tremont Street. I'm also on the Zoning Board of Appeals. I'm the Vice Chair of the Zoning Board of Appeals. When I saw this proposal coming, I was glad to see it because we really need to bring clarity here. We struggle with this on our board as well. I asked for a discussion of it at our last meeting. Last week, we had a discussion. We did not take a formal vote with our opinion, but I will describe my opinion and what I heard from some of my colleagues. Part of the reason we're interested, we met on this and to talk it through and get familiar with what's being proposed is you're asking us to play a role as the zoning board of appeals and granting special permits for the owner occupied units in the R3 and in the business zones. And looking at the criteria, that's already come up tonight. The criteria would be, well, is this new STRU or existing STRU substantially more detrimental to the neighborhood than what's there? And we'll do a public hearing and abutters will come. And we suspect a lot of the abutters will say some of the things we're hearing tonight, that, well, if you take this house that's next to me and turn it into a bunch of short-term rental units, that's more detrimental than the house that I'm living next to. Please turn it down. And as we haven't seen one yet, you haven't passed the ordinance, but some of us feel, I feel that it's particularly in the R3, it's hard to think about an abutter saying, you know, on either side of me, there are houses and they're turning into short-term units that's bad, more detrimental. I kind of agree. And several of my colleagues did too. So with the way this thing is set up, I'm not sure you're going to see a lot of short-term rental units in the R3 that make it through the screen that's been set up. Are they more detrimental than a house effectively? Anyway, that's basically our observation that I wanted to share. And thank you for the opportunity to provide input.
Thank you. Can see your hand.
Pam Kidd, 11 Tremont Street. I would echo what Ken just said and what Robert Coop said about, is this going to have a negative impact on the neighborhood? And I would really ask you guys to consider why would you think of putting investors and people earning money ahead of neighborhood peace? And I live actually across the street from Ken, and I've lived there for 34 years on Tremont Street. It's very, very dense. In our 34 years, I've watched every single house turn over probably 3 times at least. And you get to know new people and all that. And this idea of having different people every weekend, I agreed with the comment on 30 days max, because if you do 120, the weekends are the times people want to be there. That's every week. It's potentially every weekend of the year. If a snowbird wants to rent, I think they could probably do a 4-month rental. And then you adjust and you have those people in the winter and those people in the summer. And that's one thing, but it's a priority of keeping the neighborhoods filled with people who care about the issues in the city, the schools, the neighbors, you know, will you come feed my cat kind of stuff. People who are in for the weekend are not into doing that. We have a place in Franconia, New Hampshire, the lot sizes are minimum 4 acres. So you're in the woods. However, last 4th of July, I felt like I had a band in my backyard because one of the neighbors does a short-term rental on the weekends. The house sleeps 16. And it was insane. We had rocket launchers going off at the house next door to us. Who are you going to call at 3 in the morning to say they're violating the noise thing? Those are things we as neighbors shouldn't have to put up with. They also had 14 cars on them. Is that it? Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for your time and effort, folks. I guess we're the exception.
Maybe.
Oh, yeah, Tim Smith, 53 Marlborough Street. I guess we're the exception. We own an investment unit, and just 2 days ago, I had a director want to come up to me and say how they actually enjoyed the neighbors and enjoyed our renters and how they were part of the neighborhood. And they asked us when we're going to fill our property up again. I should also state that we vet our tenants to the nth degree. We don't allow parties, and I think most importantly, we're 3 minutes away from our property, and we'll be there, and our neighbors have our number. If there's an issue, we're there. And when I hear this 120-day away proposal, I think about that. I think, what would I rather live next to? You know, a well-maintained, professionally run investment unit that offers a great service to the city. We have folks there that, in addition to being part of the community, which this gentleman told me without me asking, just came up and told me. We reintroduced ourselves, and someone on this council, I think, has a similar opinion to our particular property. At any rate, if you're away for 120 days, say you're a snowbird, so you're just a plane flight away from taking care of the property. We're 3 minutes away from taking care of the property. And, you know, I call us professionals, but that's what we are. I think we offer a valuable service to the community. And it sounds like that's in a, you know, very, not exactly what we're hearing from everyone else. These are the, you know, the squeaky wheels, and I understand that. Not every other property can be short-term rental. And that's why we strongly agree with registration, license us, you know, make us pay. We do pay. We pay 6% now. We're one of the registered owners, so we do pay. And we do strongly encourage that everyone should be registered, and bad actors can be handled in that way. And I think that's an important component of this process that's not really being looked at. I mean, I think what we're doing is we're looking for solutions to a problem that really hasn't been quantified or proven to exist. I don't see it. The parking, I hear about those issues, but garbage and loud parties, not an issue that we have or that I particularly have heard about. And if it's there, why wasn't it presented? Where are the data points? How do you make an argument without data points? I don't see them, and I'd like to see them, and I'd like to interpret them and have a discussion about it, but they're not present. They're mostly anecdotal. Parking, maybe that's a different story. Not an issue where we are, but that's my story, and I'll stick to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Leila Wright, 55 Reservation Terrace. Can we talk about some of the benefits that the city's receiving as a result of the short-term rentals? I live on Plum Island. We have lots of short-term rentals, and we have always made friends like neighbors with the people that are there every week and the people that are there occasionally. It's not that difficult, and it just helps grow our community in different ways. Our restaurants, our retail shops, you know, they're not going to survive if we don't have guests coming into town. We don't have a hotel. We have very few rooms. I think we have less than 100 rooms for the inns. And when you have a family wedding, you're not going to be able to get everybody to stay in town. You're going to have people going to Amesbury, Seabrook, Salisbury, anywhere they can, because they're not going to be able to stay in Newburyport. That's a detriment. And furthermore, the people that are coming into town, not only are they spending their time and money here because they like it here, a lot of them decide to move here and become part of this community because it is a great place. And I think we need to take that into consideration. We've received hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax revenue from these short-term rentals. And everybody likes to keep it quiet, but the fact of the matter is that money is being spent. And it would be great if it was going to affordable housing, but right now it's going to pay the city's bills. And it's important that we continue moving forward. I agree, this is, you know, a good start. It's a much slimmer version of the former document. But there's a reason why this tourist community has become a tourist community, and we've worked really hard to make that happen. If we don't have a place for people to stay, we're not going to be a tourist community.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Teresa DePiero. I live at 53 Marlborough Street. I was introduced to this meeting back in April of 2022. I'm a resident, and I'm very, very concerned about STRUs and how they're being handled in the city. And as a resident, I want to make sure my neighbors are operating STRUs properly. In addition, I own STRU. It's being classified right now as an investor owned. Okay, so I wanted to start with, A question I had of the city councilors a year ago was, what is the main objective you're trying to accomplish with this ordinance? And I want you all to listen, because I agree with pretty much all of you. It's to allow STRs in the city, this is word for word, in a limited capacity, so that we don't disrupt the quality of life in the residential neighborhoods, and to find a balance between the two. So with every ordinance, we should be reading this comment or this purpose of our ordinance. Also, a year ago, they said there were 4 complaints. And I asked, what are the nature of the 4 complaints? I was told noise, overcrowding, prostitution, illegal drugs, disturbance of the peace, and excess trash. 4 of these issues are illegal. And two of these are licensure issues, in my opinion. I appreciate all the hard work you guys have done. I know James had put forward an ordinance of 13 pages, and now this is shortened to 5, and I'm very appreciative of that. I read through this, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and I asked every single person who opposes this to read through it, because if you're for it or oppose it, if you're for it, it's not necessarily, if you're for STR, if you're against STRUs, this ordinance necessarily does not support you. And I'll tell you why. First of all, I feel like
Excuse me, can you wrap up?
Sure. There's 3 terms in here: owner-occupied, investor STRUs, and Plum Island STRUs. These were pulled directly from an ordinance in Boston. Owner-occupied STRUs in Boston were usually condos that lived in, investor STRUs were condos that lived in a large condo building. So,
Please wrap up.
okay, well, can I just get to my point, because I spent a lot of time on this. So investor STRUs were investor condos in a condo building. Okay, I own an investment single family that is not attached to any walls or anybody's common space, and I am being lumped in that category. So number 1, the uses that we're distributing here are not making sense. Plum Island STRUs is not something.
Teresa, you could submit the rest of that in writing. That would be
Okay,
great.
can I just finish with a simple solution to this, in my opinion, is a licensing issue. License all STRUs so the STR owners pay taxes to the state and city of Newburyport. I currently pay taxes to the state and the city. Impose restrictions for licensed STRUs on noise, trash,
Thank you.
etc.,
Thank you.
and limit them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. go for it.
Hi there, Kelly Gray, 230 High Street. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's sitting here and everyone who has spent time on this issue, because clearly there are a lot of layers and a lot of details. So I'm very grateful for those efforts. And in particular, the document that's currently being proposed. I think that there have been a lot of things that have been taken into account to be able to really balance the needs of homeowners and people who want to keep the fabric of their community strong. You know, I'm hearing my neighbors right now saying that they're having issues. So with that, the proof is in the pudding. We're going to have to get to the point of being able to support whatever ordinance you pass. But we got to start with the ordinance. So those are things that we're going to have to figure out after this. And I can appreciate that. As far as the current document that is in front of us, again, it looks like there are a lot of things that are in there that are strong. I did want to address the 120 days, just because it seems to have come up a couple times today. That's only for owner occupied dwellings. And with an owner occupied dwelling, the concept of having to move all of your life out of your house for a weekend to have someone use your house for the weekend and then move back in Monday is probably not the way that would be used, but is more the intention of the snowbird situation where someone's gone for a longer period of time and they may not rent it for a whole 30 days. So to go into the long term. So thank you again for your efforts and for trying to balance really the benefits of all of us. As we all want to live in a community that has strong neighborhood relations and is a fun place to visit. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Reg Bacon. I live at 21 Strong Street in Newburyport. I'm going to stick to the script. How about that? Thanks so much for the effort that we made on this plan. I'm glad to be able to speak here tonight. I'm strongly opposed to the ordinance as it is proposed this evening, especially for the provisions to allow absentee investor-owned short-term rental properties. My reasons are that absentee investor-owned short-term rentals reduce the stock of our rental units, housing diversity, fragment neighborhood cohesiveness, diminish the social capital, that old school neighborliness that some people still value, and also we capitulate to the interests of the almighty buck. Now, of course, we heard all of these before and over the last year and this evening. And of course, we need to consider business interest. We need to consider that balance. I think I'm uniquely qualified to speak about balance, as a matter of fact. The Chamber of Commerce and New England Development have been heard loud and clear, but it is the residents whose property tax payments make up such a high percentage of the city's tax revenue. So I would say thanks in advance for representing us regular people who fill those tax coffers. I would also prefer that however the ordinance evolves in the weeks or months to come, that we have robust permitting through a special permit and robust enforcement. If the city is going to prioritize business in this ordinance, then the cost of enforcement is merely a cost of doing business. So I look forward to learning in the future where everybody stands. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to be heard on this? Yes, please.
Thanks for the opportunity. I'm Steve French, 164 Water Street. My wife and I have owned the house since 2004 and appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'd just like to address why we host short-term rentals and how it positively affects our city. So first, who are the short-term hosts in Newburyport? So we're regular working families enjoying sharing our homes with individuals and families. We spend much of our own time caring for the property, improving the yard, planting flowers, making Newburyport an attractive place to visit. My wife takes considerable pride decorating the spaces and gives people looking for alternative to a sterile hotel environment a nice place to enjoy. Second, we are good neighbors. Many people cite concerns of noise or parties. Noise and parties are one of the reasons we opted for short-term versus traditional long-term tenants. We felt short-term guests create less wear and tear, and we would have more control over who was in the house. Rental platforms include rating systems that evaluate guests and hosts, and we use noise monitoring software and cameras to ensure guests are respectful. The extra income from our short-term rentals allows us to take the opportunity to constantly reinvest in the property. We take pride in our home, and our neighbors regularly tell us how nice the improvements contribute to the neighborhood. Finally, I help support my fellow residents and businesses We have hosted local residents who needed short-term stays while work was done on their home due to storm damage or renovations. This past year, we hosted a couple who were former residents. The husband was diagnosed with cancer and needed to be close to Boston for care. He and his wife were grateful to have a home to relax between treatments, that they could be close to family. A hotel would not have met their needs. We've also hosted grandparents visiting adult children, people wanting to bird watch, and people who just want to enjoy the local culture. These visitors frequent the local restaurants and shops, and we make sure our guidebooks direct them to all the best local places. I agree a process needs to be in place for sensible and fair regulation. There needs to be this type of housing in Newburyport, and I'm supportive of the council adopting a process that will allow everybody to enjoy the beautiful city. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much for your time this evening. Matthew Ainsworth speaking on behalf of Matthew and Jennifer Ainsworth, 77 Curzon Mill, Newburyport. Lived in this city for 14 years with 4 children, and now a father-in-law with Alzheimer's and 1 new knee. Thank you very much. As of 10 days ago. So I dragged myself out of bed this evening to come and speak to you all. I appreciate all of the time and effort that you all put into this and how long it's been going on for. And I think, you know, every STRU person will agree that we need registration, we need controls, we need enforcement, we need it all in this city. But being an owner of multiple STRUs in this city, on the island, on the mainland, and outside of this city, long-term and short-term, we are not going to solve parking problems with STRUs being removed. In fact, we're potentially going to increase the parking problems, and I'll explain why. My STRU has 2 parking spots today, and I give them to my neighbor. We know all our neighbors, and they really appreciate it because now they have parking when the snow comes in. And I guess public parking. I thought the public parking idea was a great idea for allowing the continuation of STRUs to remove the cars off the street. But parking isn't resolved by STRUs, and we all know that because the buildings and the properties in these towns, some do and some do not have any parking, and I provide my parking. One of my neighbors has 3 bedrooms with 5 cars, and they put their boat on their parking lot and put 5 cars outside the house next to my house. That's my home. I don't have a complaint. It's okay. They're my neighbor. And so it's very important for us to all understand what problems we're trying to resolve here and how we're trying to fix it. We have very close relationships with our neighbors, and we think it's very important that we always do. We monitor our homes daily. We register and check every single one of the guests coming in. They have to be to join. And I think at this point in time, it would be good to see the city look at it from a perspective. You have 120 STRUs in the city today on the mainland that are registered. I think they should be allowed to stay registered. I think you should carry on taking that tax money. You should try and reapply it to something like affordable housing, which is a global problem right now, not just a Newburyport problem. Other than that, you're going to potentially drive 90 to 100 properties back on the market, increasing the number of cars and traffic on the streets. Being a 3-bedroom home could have 4 or 5 cars outside of it in the next so long, and is not going to help affordable housing because, as we all know, the average house now is $1 million, $1.5 million to buy. So I apologize. Yeah, I just wrap up on the note of I would like to see the city look at it from a limitation. Other cities and other towns like Kennebunkport and going up into North Conway are looking at it from a limitation standpoint to limit it to the number of properties you have to service the neighborhoods. And my last point that I wanted to make was, in the last 6 months, I've serviced 6 families in Newburyport with burst pipes, funerals, and burnt down buildings. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to live, and would have had to drive 2, 3, 4 towns away to go to their schools and live their normal lives. You're going to remove that capability from your own community by shutting it down. And we're in an R2 area where you are cutting it off completely. And where some of the bigger homes with parking actually exist, and you're compounding it into the areas where there is no parking today. That's dangerous, very dangerous for this, especially if more people come in to buy these properties in the downtown area, like Middle Street.
Yes, please.
I know it's getting late, everybody's probably heard enough, but I really think the most important thing is that, oh, sorry, Adrian Shamora, 1 Bromfield Street. A lot of problems would be resolved if the owners of the properties were present to tend to the tenants that are there. It would be basically the best regulation that you could enforce. The tenants are going to respond to the owner of the property, not to the abutters that try to work things out. The owner has to be there to be present and to be accountable for, the actions of his tenants, and not be a burden on anybody that's adjacent or a butter to them. That's about it.
Thank you very much. Well,
We do have one hand loaded. Sean, would you like to address the audience and board here?
Yes, and thank you. My name is Sean Bakhtiari. I am a resident of 8 Parker Street, and I've lived in town for 7 years now. I want to first thank everyone in the council for their work on a hard and arguably impossible task. And I know my time is limited, so I just want to take this time to talk about a couple misconceptions with short-term rentals. As a short-term rental owner myself, not in town, but out of town, I feel like I do know a lot about this space. And so I just want to talk about a couple misconceptions. The first misconception is that investors are buying a Newburyport. Yes, there might be a few quote unquote investors buying a Newburyport, but the true investors are buying outside of Newburyport for a variety of different reasons. A matter of fact, since 2020, there's only been 9 new short-term rentals, or I should say the addition of 9 short-term rentals from 2020 to 2023. It's not an investor-friendly town, so investors aren't the ones that are buying a Newburyport. They're people that are buying their second home or their dream home. They're trying to rent it out so that they could be a part of the community. The second misconception is that affordable housing will be solved by drastically restricting short-term rentals. And the truth is, well, in my opinion, I should say, housing is expensive in Newburyport, not because of short-term rentals, but because Newburyport is Newburyport. It's so desirable. It's expensive for the same reason Portsmouth is expensive, the same reason Lexington, Massachusetts is expensive, for the same reason Andover, Massachusetts is expensive. They're amazing towns with amazing amenities that are well-run with good school systems. If short-term rentals are restricted or removed, you're not going to see these owners of short-term rentals sell their house. You're going to see them transition a short-term rental into a midterm rental. That's a 31+ day rental. They're going to hold on to the property and they're still going to rent it out for lack of a better phrase, for solid rental income. There's a ton of demand for people needing 31+ furnished rentals in our town. So affordable housing likely won't be solved by this ordinance. The last misconception I want to just bring up is that there are a lot of unregistered short-term rentals in the town of Newburyport. Although I don't know the exact number, I do know that the 2 most popular platforms, Airbnb and VRBO, will not allow any listing on their platform unless it's properly registered with the state of Massachusetts. And when you register with the state of Massachusetts, you're given a certificate number. With that certificate number, you gain permission to be listed on Airbnb and Vrbo. Without that, you can't be on those 2 most popular platforms. When you are registered, anyone who books your place pays a 5.7% state tax and a 6% local tax, or 6% Newburyport tax. So I'll stop there. Again, I want to thank everyone. I think we're moving in the right direction. I think regulation is good, and I hope that we do find a balance.
Thank you very much. Nobody is raising their hand. I will close the public comment period and bring it back to the board members and councilors. And I don't know, are you ready to discuss the details of the ordinance at this point? Do you want to, having heard the public hearing, do you want to continue this hearing? Or what is your choice?
Council ready to vote? rip out the Band-Aid. Yeah, I'd be open on the council side, just to, I think we certainly want to, whether or not this hearing stays open or not, I think we, will need, planning board input. At some point sooner rather than later, formally through the written, way that we typically do that. And just continue this at, planning and development committee hearing, or excuse me, meeting, which they would be posted as a committee of the whole and kind of hash out sort of how we feel about it. I'd certainly be open to continued public input as we did previously. I think we've heard some new ideas. We certainly heard from people who we've heard from in the past, both pro and con and all the nuances in between. And I think it's helpful to just to kind of for some of those of you in the audience who've been along for the ride, hear from you again, and kind of ponder what your thoughts are. I think having some ZBA input is important, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Swan. So I think there's a lot to consider. For me personally, we all want a regime, so-called, that has registration, that has clear parameters for enforcement. I think where we're now is still probably, I guess, in a little bit of a gray area, but all of the things that Councilor Z talked about in terms of clarity. And for me, I'm very much I like the idea of somebody renting out their extra bedroom while they're there. Some wonderful tourist from somewhere else comes and you get to interact with them, sort of tell them a little bit about your community and make friends and build relationships and share Newburyport, and provide a little bit of income that I think pretty much most people need these days. So that aspect of that was in earlier, I think we all thought that was good. The piece where the owner is not necessarily present, I know we went from 90 days of allowing that for up to 90 days in a one-year period to 120. Was generally okay with that. I think there was some interesting input this evening about that 120. It's a little different now in this version, but I think it really does very much come down to the investor or no investor. The permitting aside, very much interested to hear what the ZBA, that perspective. If everything's going to get shut down in the ZBA, my immediate question is why would we then allow it? And I did serve on the ZBA for a couple of years, and pretty much everything it's going to get some neighborhood interest in detrimental impact to the neighborhood. So that we're just kind of punting something to the ZBA that it's going to end up with it not really passing muster. And so I think that's something we can all consider and kind of take a look at. And to the data point, getting a handle again on what the current numbers are as best we can understand. That was Sean Bacchiari said, we know the folks that are going through Verbo and Airbnb are in all likelihood registered, or else they wouldn't be with Airbnb and Verbo. But what is the depth of other folks operating unlicensed, unregistered, on below the radar, and what are those impacts? So I think there's a lot to consider. It's going to take a while. Where we ended in the last council was kind of stuck on the investor angle, and folks that wanted that, felt pretty strongly about that, and folks who didn't want that felt pretty strongly. I think that it sort of kind of broke in the middle. I think we're all looking for some regulation, enforcement, clarity, but we got stuck on that. Maybe this presents a way to get through that, or not. But that's just some of my personal comments. Myself, I don't know if councilors want to add anything, but we, again, whether we continue the hearing or not, I will definitely be taking this up.
Thank you. First, I really would like to say thank you to the Ward 1 counselor. I know that Counselor Zeeb has put an enormous amount of effort into this. And it's really tough to thread the needle and find compromise, but I do truly believe that compromise is the way to find a path forward that's best for the city. You know, for me, this is all about striking that balance. I'm sure anyone who's been following along, you're not going to be surprised to hear me say, you know, I very much want to find a balance where we do have enough units to serve the community, and the community being tourists, yes, but frankly, the residents. I mean, we heard clearly from people tonight who are hosting people who had frozen pipes and you know, are having their children in for the holidays, you know, having renovations in their homes. I do think there's a real need within the residents, but I also think it is really important that we find a way to mitigate the impact on the neighborhoods. So it really is about finding a way to strike a balance. And I am a very firm believer that we need to have a very strong licensing component to this so that we have excuse me, an avenue to eliminate the nuisance properties. I don't think anyone on the council or anyone here, even if you own a short-term rental unit as an investor, I don't think anybody wants to allow for nuisance properties to continue to exist in the city. And we need to find a way forward. But to do that, we have to get an ordinance in place and we have to have a strong licensure in place. And I really would like to see us get there. It'll probably come as absolutely no surprise, but I do plan to propose some amendments to this. And I really do look forward to the input that we should be getting back from the planning board. However, from, you know, sort of a nuts and bolts, I would argue we probably should not debate within the council tonight. I mean, it is almost 9 o'clock. I think we probably had a lot of short-term rental units already tonight. I think we have a lot of opportunity to take this up in our planning and development committee. And within that, we'll have a lot of opportunity, you know, for us to debate, to continue to get comment. And I think we'd be a lot fresher if we weren't to do all of that here and now.
Councilor Z, I'd like to, I know you've been taking a lot of notes, even before, in the last month, you've been taking a lot of notes from other people. Are you thinking about coming back with, I know you've been trying to avoid confusion by just having one draft up to this point. Are you planning to come with a revised draft, or are you looking for a recommendation from the planning board before you would produce a revised draft?
Thank you. Yeah, one thing I would like to do is to avoid many drafts outstanding. And I think that didn't help serve the purpose. It was not clear for residents and interested parties. And I think it, again, if I may, following Councilor Preston, I mean, this is what I've written down, that the issues that I would like input on from everybody. The first one is, obviously there's a question about the R3. It just as a broad philosophical question, allowance for investor units in R3 or not, is clearly a point of debate. So that would be one thing I'd like to hear more from, you know, everybody in terms of what their thoughts are. The second one is a dovetail or not, depending on how you look at it, and that's the special permit aspect. If the will of the majority is not to allow in an R3, the special permit may become moot, or if there is a desire to have an R3 as has been proposed, then the special permit could have validity. So that those two are related. And the third one is the number of days, you know, allowance for not for owner occupied, but in not present, let's call it. We're at the 120 days. You've heard a little bit about that. Things about enforcement and verification and things like that, I think are largely licensing issues. So my point with making this list was these are the points where I think if I could respectfully ask to help direct the conversation to say those 3 points, then I think you have a framework. And if we say came to agreement on those 3 pieces, then we can start, you know, tweaking individual sentences here and there, but it would prove that the foundational elements, as I think somebody called them, are sound. And it hasn't gone off the rails, frankly, ahead of that. If people don't like the definitions of investor versus owner occupied, those are two foundational. So that would be my ask is, that we have that. That's what I'd like to hear about. If I missed anything on my list, but I don't know, you might be thinking I'm ready to jump off a bridge, but it was a great meeting. I mean, that's not a 400 list long thing. That's 3. Now, granted, they're big and important things, and counselors may be wanting to up them, or some might want to be to down them, which is how I feel good about my efforts. It's up somewhere in the middle. But that would be my ask, and I don't know, I defer to the chairs what the format is, if it's a continuation of this hearing, if it's a retirement to the Planning Development Committee, and then to amendments.
So either the direct report, just find out the pros and cons of, for the council to keep the hearing open.
Sure. Actually, yeah, my mic isn't working, but I'll just.
Here, Zoom won't be able to hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, again, well, it's ultimately up to the council, the planning board, with that question, to the context that some of us have seen over a 2-year period in the prior efforts of other councils to try to bring forward amendment dealing with this particular use, which is currently dealt with directly in the zoning ordinance. My sense is that it may be beneficial to the process to actually close this public hearing, taking all the input you received, and to allow the planning board then to be able to give a comment on it, and to the council's use questions and any other areas you want to cover, and allow that feedback to go to the council through the planning and development committee so that it can be digested and taken with whatever other comments the council and committee received, the committee of the whole receive in the council end, and then decide what to do with it from there. It doesn't preclude the planning board from providing additional feedback on that process going forward. But having seen the dialogue go on for several years, I wonder if it would really be a benefit to send another version back to a continued public hearing and so forth. I think you've heard from the range of comments we're going to hear. And so my sense is that you may be able to take whatever thoughts you have on that planning board members, provide that to the councilors, and allow the planning development committee, which is also closest to the whole, which is all councilors, to take that and decide ultimately, as they will have to anyway, ultimately what to do with it. So that would be my sense of how best to proceed, rather than potentially prolonging a process will be ultimately the same issues, same policy questions that have to be answered today.
Councilman.
I have a question for the two chairs. If we close the hearing tonight, then the 90-day clock starts. And the question is, do we have space on our legislative calendar to address this within, again, remember, we have limited meetings in July going forward. So, would it be helpful to keep it open till, your second meeting in May, and then open it up, and then that would allow us to have someone to work with it. I think we have one meeting in July, so that's what this is doing.
I think it might make sense then. That does make sense. And you have a few things going on with council.
Budget. Does that mean keeping the joint public hearing open till the second meeting so that you would come back to us in the second meeting? Is that the suggestion? Or keeping the planning board?
Maybe keeping the planning board hearing open, that, and then the 90 days would start. The 90 days would start once you close. Right. Yeah, I think that would be good. That would get us the time.
Yeah, sorry. Some of us deal with zoning all the time, so the fundamental difference here is whether or not the council is continuing to be with the planning board to hear that dialogue and to have that discussion versus closing the public hearing, at which point a 90-day clock is running to take action on that. Here, I think we can keep that open a little longer, take additional feedback in the future meetings, and then allow that clock to close where the 90-day clock would be running, and that would be in the council's court, showing all three in the wall, discuss further. And again, we also got to the council.
I think the question is, could we keep statutorily? I think it's the planning board's closing the public hearing.
That's the trigger.
So we can keep the planning board hearing open, and the planning and development committee could close its portion of the public hearing, and not have to come back to talk to us. That's kind of the.
Yes, I see. Yes.
I think that'd be more efficient.
Yeah, if I could, sorry. Just one consideration, I think this is maybe a little bit unique to Newburyport, this idea of being a joint public hearing between, the city council and the planning board versus a hearing that's happening almost in isolation by itself. There is sometimes benefit to sharing that dialogue together, so I think you just want to consider how that dialogue is shared if it is being done in separate forms.
There would be nothing to preclude planning board from attending the planning and development committee meetings.
Correct.
So based on that, I entertain a motion from the committee members to close the council portion of the joint hearing.
So moved.
Second.
So moved by Councilor Wright and seconded by Councilor Preston. All committee members in favor. I don't think we need a roll call because we're all here.
Aye.
Aye.
So that's a 3-0. We're closing our portion. You will continue yours. We will join up together. To be determined. And continue to deliberate and for that.
So I'd like to have a motion from the planning board to continue the public hearing to our first meeting in May. We was the 3rd. That would enable the public to continue to comment, but we would provide another opportunity for the public to comment, but it would be primarily for the purpose of deliberating among ourselves on a recommendation of assistance.
Second.
Alden seconds. Okay, and you're all here. So we do not need to have a roll call. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? So we are continuing the hearing on this until the 8:30 meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Give some time. Crowds to leave. We'll move on to our next item.
Yeah. All your hands, you want to get out of here. Good night. Thank you for your help. I appreciate it. Back on.
Yeah.
Okay, next item on the agenda is a pre-application conference concerning 49 to 57 Merrimack. Go ahead.
Boy, that was fast. Thank you, Rick. Members of the planning board, it's nice to be back. I don't know all of you. I was last in front of the board about a year ago. But what we'd like to do, just for the record, Nick Frecknell, 13 Picard Street. I live across the river in Amesbury, and I'm representing Renee Bernard, who's the owner of the property at 4957 Merrimack. Renee also lives next door in the building at the intersection of Green and Merrimack Street. So on our design team, we have other members that I don't think are here tonight, but will be probably moving forward. We have Julie McDonald and John Harden from Olson and Lewis Architects from Beverly. They did the preliminary floor plans and the elevations that are in that packet. The Millennium Engineering will ultimately do the site plan should we move forward with the project. So we're here really to reintroduce the project. We were here in 2019 with essentially the same project. The program's changed a bit. The parking configuration's been updated, but knowing there's new members and Renee has decided to reinvigorate his efforts to move forward with this project. That's why we're back here for a pre-application conference, because we do have a lot of permitting in order to bring this to fruition. I think we need 4 special permits. We need 1 for the use, 1 for the height of the building from the zoning board of appeals. The building in the district here is allowed to be 40 feet. This is 40 feet as of right. It's allowed, I think, an additional 8 feet with a special permit from the zoning board of appeals, and we're going to be seeking that special permit for, I think, 5.5 feet. We need a special permit from you folks under the downtown overlay district to remove the former gas station building, the service station building that's on the property today. It is in the National Register District as well as the DOD. And the last special permit, I think we're going to be requesting, if we move forward with the project in the manner in which it's presented here, is to request that we make a payment under the Intermodal Transportation Improvement Fund for some of the parking for the commercial use alone, none of the residential units that would be in the building. They'll all have on-site parking. And obviously we need site plan approval. So I think there's 3 or 4 permits from the planning board and 1 from the zoning board of appeals, if again, the project moves forward, looking the way it's being presented tonight. So we're here just to give you an overview of what we're thinking in terms of a program and a building and a site plan. Get your feedback on parking configuration, because it is different from what we were contemplating back in 2019. And hear your feedback on the building and site design. So if we could jump ahead, Andy, a couple of slides. This is the packet. Okay, perfect. Really quick, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You guys are very familiar, I'm sure, with this site. It's about 17,000 square feet with 180 feet of frontage on Merrimack Street, right around the corner from City Hall. And it was a former gas station. The tanks were pulled, I don't know, 15 odd years ago. The site is clean. Renee has done a full 21E of the property with ransom. All those documents are available if anybody wants to see them as we move forward. Maybe jump ahead. Obviously, the Tickram parking structure is right next door on the next block. This is an interesting photo from the mid 20th century. The mid 20th century. These buildings probably that are no longer on the site, of which there were 4 here, 3 of them with mixed use ground floor uses of the building, and I think I counted 6 residential units, 4 commercial units. These buildings were all raised when the gas station was built in the late 1960s. I think it was a Sinclair station originally, and I don't know what it transitioned through to be Gibbs, but all that's left of this gas station on that property is obviously the service station building at the back of the site. So go to the next slide, please. It's in the B2 district that really ribbons the southern side of Merrimack Street from the Gillis Bridge or the overpass into the central business district, with the WMU, the waterfront mixed use district, and the waterfront west on the northern side. Next slide, please. So again, sort of stating what you've all seen, that's where the building's positioned at the back of the site. There's a very large area at the front where the pump islands used to be, and obviously the dispensers. Next slide, please. So that's looking from Merrimack Street. You see that every day when you drive in. It supports, I don't know, 30 plus or minus cars park out in that area between Renee's building, which is right there on the left-hand side of the screen where he resides, and the building at the corner of Tickram Street. Next slide, please. So this is the hand-drawn rendering that we presented in 2019 of what we envision would be a appropriately sized, scaled, and designed or stylistically designed building to really reestablish the street wall between the corner of Green Street, now all the way down to the end of the parking structure and the recent building that was built at the foot of Market Street. It's really trying to activate that street, weave it back together, and activate the sidewalk. And this was the design approach we took in 2019. We're still approaching the site in the same manner now. The next slide shows you the view from the west looking east. Again, it's a fairly traditional skin for that building, and with some contemporary elements, with the recessed sort of penthouse on the 4th floor and the the roof canopy for the main entrance into the building. We're trying to incorporate the same streetscape improvements that are along the corridor, and where we can integrate some landscaping as well as the period lights and the brick sidewalks. Next slide, please. So this is a change from the 2019 layout. What we tried to do, given what we realized would be a very high cost of parking to go underneath this building and put a basement in, fight maybe with the groundwater, which may or may not be present at the depth of underground parking. What we've tried to do with this approach is have all the parking at grade and design the building so it's deep enough that it can support sufficient retail or office space along Merrimack Street. I think we've got about 3,500 square feet of retail space there, theoretically divided into up to 3 users. We want to have accessible doorways as frequently as possible along Merrimack Street to again activate the street. So if we're lucky enough to have 3 users, those doors would be within 40 feet of each other, probably 3 of them there, obviously, if it's subdivided in that manner, which again will create a more interesting streetscape if it's subdivided along the street like that. On the back of the building, we've got 12 parking spaces that are at grade. So this is a slab on grade building. There'd be no basement under the building itself. Those 12 spaces would be undercover in the back of the building. And then the remaining 16 spaces you see next to the police station driveway, those would be, at least in this scheme, for now, open surface parking spaces. So there are, I think we have 28 spaces shown there. It's enough to cover the 16 units that we're contemplating in the top 3 floors. And we have a few spaces there to apply to the commercial use of the ground floor. But again, there's a gap for the majority of the commercial off-street parking requirements on the site. We have no lifts and again, no subterranean parking in this scheme. Next slide, please. This is the parking table that has the numbers. I think there's a 36 there on the parking required and a 28 on the parking provided. So there's a gap of 8 spaces. We have had comments come in this week from staff in City Hall asking whether we've met the ADA requirements for the quantity of spaces on the site as well as the protected access to get to the front entryway. So we're going to have to make sure we've got that right before we come back here. The building is about 27,000 and almost 28,000 square feet. Again, it's 4 stories, about 45 feet in height. Next slide, please. So that was our original inspiration drawings at the top, which led to those hand-drawn renderings in 2019. And what Olson and Lewis did was take the hand-drawn renderings and convert it into a facade that resembles as best we can that inspirational image that we started with back in 2019 when we were last here. So we've got it dimensioned, we've got it working with the grades on the site, we have a detailed survey, and I think in the next slide, well, this was the ground floor again, showing the parking with the retail. I think we're going to go through the floor plates here. So that's first floor, ground floor, street level. The second floor, we've got 6 residential units, a mix of 1 and 2 bedroom units with the stairways and the elevator on the outside. It repeats itself on the next floor, and then the top floor has, I think we're talking 4 units, at least in this scheme, with private roof decks would be along Merrimack Street on that recessed portion behind the parapet wall. And where you see the large roof area on the 3rd floor with the mechanicals, we'd certainly want to have mechanicals on the back of the building out of sight, but it's likely we're going to have some shared roof deck space for the lower floor units to be able to come up onto that 3rd floor roof behind that hallway. Next slide, please. So I think that's the last slide. We're really looking for feedback tonight on the project as a whole, the building and site plan, the parking. Whether you've got any suggestions for us as we go forward with preparing detailed drawings that we're going to need to file this.
Any comments, questions for Nick?
A couple of quick questions, just in terms of the site plan. And how you anticipate providing service to the retail.
I mean, for deliveries?
Yeah.
I don't know that I know that answer yet. So we will have to figure that out.
I think it may affect those 12 parking spaces that are end to end across the back of the building. Providing access to the retail. Just a question.
Yep.
I noticed the dumpster area identified on the plan, and it would be good to understand how that works, how a truck accesses the dumpster, given the building overhang, and how all of that works on the backside.
Good question. We'll have the turning templates.
It's turning and it's also clearance.
Yeah, for the roof.
Depending on the type of
Solid
dumpster you're
waste.
using and whether it's, that thing. So I think those are things that we'd be interested in understanding.
Yep.
How
I have an observation, not necessarily a comment, but could you perhaps, Andy, could you go to one of the elevations that had both the rendering and the hard line drawing? It showed a couple times, yeah. Just an observation, not trying to express a preference necessarily yet, but I actually think that there's quite a difference between those two images. The infill of glazing between kind of brick columns, is how I read the top rendering, versus much more punched openings in the lower elevation. And I think those are really pretty significantly different buildings at the end of the day, even though they have the same column spacing and everything. So I'm starting to get a sense of a preference I might have, but I just, at the moment, just want to make an observation that I think they're really pretty dramatic.
What's your preference?
Well, I saw color rendering. It's hard not to, kind of like the appeal of the color rendering, right? So I just think if you're going to expand on that lower scheme, it's going to need a lot more thought to be as convincing
as the rendering. No, that's good. We struggled with that.
Just another quick question on the parking. So 3 of the spaces would be designated commercial. Are those going to be assigned and obvious which ones they are?
I think they'd have to be. It's the residential, presuming the residential units are going to want to know where they have to park. That's going to need to be obviously laid out. And it could be we have less when we deal with the solid waste issues of the clearance and the circulation pattern and any ADA requirements that may further reduce the number of parking. We won't have less than we need for the residential, but we may not end up with 3 spaces at the end. But they'll have to be.
You have a question, Amber?
I have a question and I guess a comment. I think
Yep.
Nick just alluded to. The ADA coordinator, we had asked them for review because we'd run into some issues of both accessible path, not so much the count of ADA spaces on site, because I think you've got the appropriate count for what you provide, but you need where they're located and the accessible path to both the residential and the retail component, as well as the second means of egress out and the accessible egress path from the building will affect those 12 parking spaces underneath. So I think there are some of these other items that will be addressed, both service and quantity of spaces through the reconfiguration that I know you will look at.
Yep.
So, but.
Just following up on Jamie's comment, I had actually looked at comparing the conceptual elevation with the dimension elevation, and there were a number of things that jumped out at me. One was exactly what Jamie mentioned, the kind of the filling in the glazing between the columns versus having punched windows in there. I certainly, I don't think it's just the color.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I felt that the first conceptual one, which is in the elevation, but also in all the renderings, had a lot of variety in it, and it had a lot of detail that I think got lost then the transition to the dimensioned elevation. And then one thing I did is I actually looked across the street at 44 Merrimack, which actually kind of splits the difference. The windows fill the gaps between the columns, but they do have that kind of flat lintels and stuff. I mean, I really like the arched windows, but then I wondered, well, does that exist anywhere else? I looked across the street and it doesn't. So, I mean, this is not really our business, you know, to look at the architecture, but it's in terms of preference, that was, I really like the varying spaces between first and second and third floors, as opposed to what we see here, which is kind of uniform and plain. And then the other thing that I was sorry we lost, and I understand why we lost it, is those large first floors. And you've had to, there's a 3.5 foot rise across the site, which makes it hard for you to have that tall commercial first floor. And it's really, it ends up being 12 feet, but I think it was much larger in your original idea. I was wondering whether it was possible to, this is kind of a strange thing for me to say, but whether it's possible to gain some additional height. You know, I know you're asking for something more than the zoning allows by right, but I almost wonder whether it'd be possible to have a more imposing building by adding a couple of feet to the first floor. And I understand as I look at it, I say, well, that even makes it harder to make the accessible entrances and everything. So it may not be possible, but those are a couple of things I was thinking about. I was wondering if you knew at this point what the elevations, the roof elevations of the third and fourth floors are and how they relate to the buildings on the left and right. Do you happen to know that at this point, or you don't? Is this?
I mean, we know that the height is 46 feet on the building we're proposing, but no, I haven't measured it up against Renee's existing building next door. I think the rendering is probably on top there, fairly accurate, but we should definitely look at it in relation to the stick frame building on the corner.
Yeah, well, and especially the next building. I think it's just understanding whether a taller building.
Right, how that's going to work. Yeah.
And then I was just, the other thing that I had a question about was the bedroom count versus the breakdown of the facade. So on the facade on the bottom of page 12, it says 2-bed unit, 1-bed unit, 2-bed unit. But is that referring to the second and third floor? It's not referring to the fourth floor, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so but that does correspond to the second and third floor?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to Rick's comment about the retail floor height? There's a 3.5 foot grade change across the site. And one way of getting more height is to step the ground floor slab, which you may have to do relative to door locations anyway. So at the far left-hand portion of the elevation, you could set a floor slab elevation at a point where you might get closer to 15 feet before the floor and locate the door relative to the sidewalk elevation there. So something that you have to look at as retail leasing kind of evolves. But the nature of the site is that if you plan on multiple doorways along that 3.5 foot grade change, I think the last thing you want to do is create a transition up to a higher slab elevation. That's never a good situation. So it almost begins to suggest that the slab step down with the sidewalk or step up going down. And I think that would help. I also agree with the comments about the different column spacing in the hardline drawing than freehand drawing. And I think some of the references, particularly across the street, have column spacing that's more like the freehand drawing. And it allows,
that was the inspiration.
Allows the windows to span between those columns and create a very different expression for the building. So I would totally agree with those points. Thank you.
Really, this is mainly for the planning board, obviously, you feedback to the board you're going to. I just, one thing, a couple of things. One is, I think we're talking about a special permit from the planning board here and the DOD, rather than the ZBA.
Right.
Just because we
Correct.
have when it's constructed, so you would have maybe more streamlined permitting.
Right.
Multiple boards per se.
Actually, and does that mean that that's the height special permit as well? or-
Yes, the DOD,
Is it?
the planning board acts as a special permit granting.
Even
authority,
for
so-
the height?
Right. So I
Oh,
just
that's
wanted
awesome.
to know that.
Okay.
Just for clarity. But the points I just want to make were relative to the design of the project. I mean, there's a lot of fine grained details involved in waiting at a time on something like this or on any project. Generally speaking, I would say I think it's beneficial to the streetscape to add the retail sort of activated first floor uses. It'd be nice to be able to extend that section there. This section of, Merrimack Street been in transition, obviously, and it continues to be so. Going forward from when the fitness factory, was there. We had a fair amount of debate about the parking garage and tried to recreate, as best we could with a parking garage, something that would fit in downtown. I think we were reasonably successful given it's a monolithic, structure that we brought in pieces. So I agree with the comments I made earlier about the top rendering being a little bit more, feeling a little bit more organic, feeling a little bit more like there's transparency with the windows. I recognize why someone might, from a cost or efficiency perspective, want to build sort of a modern version of that. I see the similarities between them. But I also, I think of the Atkinson building in addition to that. And I think that the rendering shows very well. I think, how that could maybe fit in the streetscape there. And feel a little bit more like it's in that scenario, like it feels like it maybe traditionally belonged in downtown versus something that maybe feels a little bit more like a block down, that scenario. That's a little bit harsh language maybe, but that's sort of the spectrum I'm seeing between these two. They're both, I think, could be beneficial projects. I tend to think the top one, has a little more in terms of its articulation or the nuances to it. The roof space to me is a little less clear. And this one sort of like, I think it's important that you step back, if things that are under there. It's certainly a discussion we've had about Waterfront West. And I would note, by the way, for comparison purposes, the 26 Merrimack Street project, or Market Street project, that project, if you look at that building, is actually a fair amount taller than the other building behind it. And that sort of dynamic has been a sensitive issue downtown, the height of buildings, new structures, say, versus the historic ones in various different contexts. Well, that one is actually taller than the buildings behind it, and that has been a sensitive issue in the past. I'm not necessarily opposed to that project. I actually see it as benefiting the streetscape in the same sort of mixture that it has there. It's a tight site, and it certainly is a sort of difficult project to work in there. We saw a lot of issues recently relative to parking on that site, sort of after the fact. But those got worked out, and I think in this case, it may be sometimes beneficial to consider a tighter site and having that activated. So I think there's benefit to this project, generically speaking. There are finer grained details I definitely agree need to be worked out. But that being said, I think it'd be nice to see a project like this come forward, rather than sort of the status quo that's been there, per se over time. I know there was debate years ago, even of having the parking garage, beyond the site. And it would be nice to have this section of Merrimack Street continue and extend further this way.
Just one question, just to make me feel comfortable. All the renderings in the hand-drawn image clearly show brick. This is going to be brick.
Yes. That's the intention. Right?
It's hard to say. It looks like it, but it's not defined. So I just want to make sure
That maybe not all four sides.
well, the public facing side.
Yes.
This is back. Does anybody else have any comments or questions on this plan? I think it's a great plan. I hope we see you before another 4 years.
Right? We will try. And we appreciate the feedback. And,
Yeah, this is great.
thank you, Rick. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good.
Next item on the agenda. Probably should. Yes. Oh, sorry, CPC representative. What is that about?
Sorry, in terms of, sorry.
It's on the
What?
agenda. It's on the agenda.
So we need to have a new CPC representative, recognizing, that there's a changeover there. One thing that we've discussed a little bit internally, I think, something I'd like to address longer term is just that there seems to be a unnecessarily long process after the planning board is approved a representative. It ultimately still has to be approved by the city council, even though it's a member of the board that's already been appointed to this board and would just be serving as a liaison to the CPC. That's a mechanical thing, beyond this board per se, but it's just one of those things for efficiency. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that we have to have that extra step in between going to committee and waiting weeks in between. And we're off season right now for CPC cycle, so they don't typically look at applications off cycle and look at them in the spring. They also have a public hearing in the fall, but the main focus of their time is in the spring and look at the application. So here I would be a representative that primarily would be focused on reviewing those applications in the spring.
Next spring.
Next spring, correct. And or potentially an off-cycle application when it comes in, but I think we're really talking about next spring.
So are you looking for a volunteer?
Yeah, hopefully a volunteer as opposed to, someone who isn't here tonight because volunteer.
Is anybody interested in serving on the community preservation? No.
And we could carry this on your desk. It's not as like urgent per se right now, but ultimately, obviously, there is one of the designated liaison positions for the species. So we'd like to obviously for the next cycle at least have somebody there. I wouldn't say it's urgent per se, but obviously, like I said, this ultimately has to still go to the city council. So we want to allow them time at least, circling back. I don't know if there's a preference here for just sort of carrying this thing.
I would like to carry this forward and maybe ask everybody to look at it. Can you maybe kind of either you or you and Don or somehow come up with kind of a brief summary of how much work this is, how frequently the committee meets, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Distribute it to the board so that we.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to distribute to the board a summary of that. I can tell you right now, it's in my view, comparatively a relatively light-lived. They tend to be non-controversial type projects, which is a good starting point. They also tend to be ones where you're granting funds or you're recommending the grant of funds to the city council for good projects. There was sometimes debate about, details or whether or not it's required to go forward, but oftentimes you are reviewing online applications. They're all submitted in the open up system, the way that the permits are now for special permits with variances and things. The applications are all submitted online. You're able to skim through those applications, see which ones you sort of support, have questions about. And you're really talking about 2 to 3 meetings in the spring timeframe that are really key. After that, to be fair, there's not a significant lift there. The committee actually doesn't need to meet, on a monthly basis, the way that this program has to meet twice a month. So realistically, your load is really looking at, say, 10 to 15 applications, in the spring typically, for 2 to 3 meetings, primarily 2 if you've done 2 applicants present, and you hear those presentations, and that third meeting is when you're actually just ranking them. But it's a light lift, I would say, relatively speaking, because ultimately speaking, the committee just needs your liaison, vote relative to the project.
Any questions about that? No? Move on to the next item. Approval of minutes of April 5th. I submitted some comments. Anybody has any comments? Accept a motion to approve.
I'll move to approve minutes.
A second?
Second.
Second, Jamie. Okay, and again, we don't do roll call. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Oh, you're abstaining. Okay. And so it is 5 to 9. I can't count. Any other updates? One thing I want to say is that the mayor has set up a boards and commissions informational forum or open house or something for May 4th. Right after our next time we're doing this. And so we have representatives from all the boards and so on, standing at the table or something, telling people how great it is to be on the planning board. So, and we are now at, well, as of the second meeting in May, I think Don will be off the board, and so we'll be down to 7. So we'll be looking forward to associate members. Okay. Anything else from anybody else? If not, we can be out of here. So the motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Delvin, yes.
Second.
Jamie?
Sorry.
All all in favor of adjourn?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Thank you.
Good.